Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Leadership in Housing event. I'm hoping this will be a really interactive session. I've just had a really great chat at my table, and somebody made the comment that we don't have the dry old croissants or the sparkling water to get us going, but I do hope that you're all suitably refreshed and geared up for the day. My name is Ellie Holt, and I am the Group Director of Assets at Notting Hill Genesis and a very proud board member of the Chartered Institute of Housing. I'm really excited to be chairing this event today. I do believe that we face a skills crisis in our sector, and I welcome the much needed insight and debate into this important subject. We have some fantastic speakers. I've met with them this week, and I'm sure there'll be lots of participation and engagement from our audience. This year, the Institute of Leadership and Management partnered with CIH to research leadership succession planning within the social housing sector. As a young-ish leader, this is a subject that is very close to my heart. I was recently promoted to a senior leadership role, and whilst I am enjoying the challenge and the responsibility that the role offers, I'm acutely aware of everything I still have to learn and respectful of my more experienced executive colleagues. The housing sector has evolved and changed significantly over the last 5 years and really significantly over the last 6 months. And with that change, there is an inevitable requirement for a change in skill set. When housing associations came into fruition, many of them were small charitable organisations. Of course, many still are. However, a large number have grown and developed into complex and specialist organisations, providing a range of different services and products to our residents and our customers. Many of our current leaders had the fortunate opportunity to grow and develop as the organisations became more complicated. This gave them the time to develop the range of skills necessary to lead the brilliant organisations that we see today. Many of our future leaders have and will not have this luxury. This, coupled with the different skills that are required to succeed in today's sector, for example, collaboration, digital and innovation, as well as the difficult political and global political environment we find ourselves in, I believe add up to a huge problem in terms of skills gap. We are on a cliff edge in terms of developing the world-class leaders we need to provide housing to those in most need, and now really highlights more than ever those individuals that need our help. It is more important that we look to increase and promote diversity in leadership, creating more representative, inclusive, and ultimately more successful organisations. The CIH is reviving its Diversity 2020 pledge, and considering recent events around the world, they've increased their focus on developing diversity within their own leadership. I am helping to support this work at CIH. They currently offer new board membership called Building Better Boards, which includes quarterly sessions for best practice sharing and networking on important issues. One of our own board members at Notting Hill Genesis recently attended one of these events and gave some really good feedback. They also offer leadership training sessions with an ILM accredited trainer and qualifications up to level 5. And most exciting of all, a membership offer around leadership commencing after today's event, which will bring together current and aspiring leaders into one network covering the themes of the report and any topical issues as we go along. The research carried out has identified the capabilities and knowledge required of our future leaders and sets out what we need to develop the best people to close the skills gap. The day will start with Kate Cooper. Kate is Head of Research, Policy and Standards at the Institute of Leadership and Management, where she shapes an innovative research programme to inform, inspire and impact the practice of great leadership wherever it happens. Kate joined the Institute from a career in university programme leadership in the areas of management, strategy and professional development. Kate will launch the Leadership in Housing report, which was carried out over the last 2 years. Ironically, when I spoke to Kate about this week, although it was carried out over the last 2 years, the themes identified have become even more important due to the current pandemic. We will then hear from Alysha Burrell of Homes England and CIH Futures. I have a soft spot for CIH Futures. Alysha Burrell has a background in economics and finance and currently works as a transaction analyst at Homes England, and she also sits on the board of CIH Futures. About 10:50-ish, we'll have a break, and this might be an opportunity to network with colleagues. Just on an aside, if you do have time to add a photo to your profile, it's easier to see who's sitting at which tables, or you might just want to grab a coffee or have a comfort break or catch up on some emails. After the break, we're going to hear from Dr. Paul Verma. I spoke to Dr. Verma in the week. He spent 30 years of his career in policing, rolling out leadership development both nationally and internationally. A fascinating career. Going to be really interesting to hear from him. In 2013, he set up his own company, delivering coaching and leadership development across a range of sectors. We're then going to head into a panel Q&A where we hope to hear from Kate, Cull and Alysha, and that'll be an opportunity to debate some of the issues we've heard throughout the morning. And then finally, Rebecca Clark, Head of Membership at CIH, will launch the membership offer. So without further ado, because you've probably heard enough from me, I'm going to hand over to Kate Cooper to talk through the research that's been carried out on behalf of CIH. Oh, you're on mute, Kate.
Thank you very much, Ellie. That was a great introduction. And I've been really looking forward to launching this research because it was, as Ellie said, it was quite a long time ago that we did it. We conducted 6 2-hour focus groups with CEOs, senior leaders from the housing sector, asking them about this looming capability gap. You know, what did they think had caused it? What should be done about it, what was being done about it, in fact. And so the opportunity to tell you about it today is so welcome. Really pleased to be able to do that. Of course, the full report will be available to anybody who wants to read it. But what I'd like to do is really talk about those highlights. And as is so often the case in organisations, if you ask people what the problems are, they know, you know, they're experiencing them. And they also have brilliant solutions. And it's bringing people together and gathering a momentum and a real will to affect change that makes change. So I'll go through some of the things that we thought were really interesting and then the recommendations that again arose from the experience of running those focus groups. Anybody who's done any sort of leadership or management course will have done a Pestle analysis. When you look at what's going on in your sector, outside your organisation, and saying, how important is this to us? And of course, in the housing sector, that so many aspects of that Pestle analysis are absolutely crucial, important, and affecting the sector so frequently. So here, the leaders that we were talking to in the focus groups identified the economic impact and how lots of instances how the social disadvantage has changed the sectors to some extent, and we had different sorts of service users, different people having to engage with. Then of course there's government was mentioned frequently about changes in policy and different directives being given. Demographics, we know that the population is getting older, we know that we're going to have more and more older people to look after. That's a big deal. And how could anybody say that technological influences weren't going to affect them? So what this means is leaders in the sectors need to be able to sort of embrace and understand all that change and have the resilience to keep on keeping on, as it were. A very strong theme, and I probably will mention this quite a few times, was how important knowledge of the sector was considered to be. And an understanding of housing, not just as a sector where things happen as in normal sectors, but almost a calling about the important social values of the people who have joined the sector, grown up in the sector, and are now senior leaders in that sector. But of course, as I said, when we looked at those sort of Pestle features that have changed, stakeholders have changed because the sector's changed. There are so many new players, new entrants into it. So the relationships have become more complex, and the ability to deal with those diverse stakeholders has, of course, been increasing rapidly. People were very concerned about succession planning. obviously we did the research because there was an identification of the looming leadership capability gap. But what are we going to do about filling those gaps? There's a great awareness that a whole tranche of senior leaders were due to retire and leave. And what are we going to do about filling those places? Very strong message. And I think Ellie is emphasized that in her introduction, that an awareness that actually, do you know, we've got a huge amount of talent in the sector already and we're just not properly using it. So how do we go about developing and using the incredible talent that exists? Formal training courses, absolutely, as again, you know, Ellie mentioned how important that they are, but also people were saying, you know what, we also like the less formal coaching, mentoring, things that really help us develop as individuals. So what conclusions did we reach here? Well, absolutely talked about what does it take to be a great leader in the housing sector? What are we expecting from people? What is expected from people? If somebody who's an aspiring leader, what is it that they need to be thinking about now in order to develop and to grow so they too can become senior leaders in the housing sector in the not too distant future? So commercial skills, absolutely recognised, much more different sorts of business models that are being used. We need to understand different ways of running a business, but that social conscience has got to always be present. And understanding the technical knowledge that's needed, the commercial skills that people have to acquire, and the social values actually given more emphasis. That understanding of the social mission, if you like, of the sector was actually given more emphasis than leadership capabilities. But leadership, of course, was a recurrent theme because that was the subject of the discussions, and an awareness that something needs to be done. Drawing in people from outside the sector was very interesting, and lots of discussion about that. And obviously, people have different views on that. And if we want to innovate, if we want things to change, if we want to look at things with a fresh pair of eyes, then it's often important to actually bring in people from outside housing. But what I think was being really stressed was that those people must appreciate that social calling that I've talked about, an understanding of the social values, and actually learn about the sector. So some suggestions that were given here was join by all means from outside, but be willing to shadow, do secondment, listen to people who've been working in the sector for a long time, whether that's peers, whether that's senior people, or indeed whether that's junior colleagues. Real encouragement, and I think that's good advice for anybody moving from one sector to another. Really listen and find out what's going on before you decide to bring all the great things that you undoubtedly are bringing with you. Mentioned earlier that this need for resilience, and funnily enough that we're going to challenge that in a few minutes, but that idea of adapting all the time to all those drivers for change that the sector experiences, and having leaders that are able to do that and not overwhelmed by that very volatile, if you like, landscape. And what is, of course, very interesting, again, as Ellie mentioned at the beginning, there was a lot of concern about people not being in offices anymore, people working remotely, distributed teams, flexible working, people working different hours, different sorts of contracts. And that, of course, requires a different sort of leadership and management. And when you think about it, this is pre-COVID. Now, of course, at the moment, everybody's talking about this. Well, how do we manage people that we never or rarely see? How do we help support people who want to flex their working day? All these big questions that have emerged since March of this year were already being highlighted in the sector, 2 years ago. And back to that increased complexity of the sector and the sorts of business models and the sorts of organizations that are part of it means that leaders are having to have different sorts of relationships, managing more complex relationships, of course, and need to be building networks all the time. And maybe before, previously, it was okay just to know people in housing. And I think many sectors would say that. But now it's not okay anymore. And we want people who are able to go out there to become important part of networks, to join networks that don't perhaps immediately make immediate sense, but actually are helping us manage these complex relationships and understanding the diversity of stakeholders. So they're the research highlights and a few of the conclusions. So now the recommendations that emerge from the report, I'm going to go through them one at a time. And these, of course, were great thing about when you're doing focus group research, that you try and get people to stay on the question in hand. But of course, people stray off and new interesting conversations develop. So as the research was taking place, as the focus groups were happening, and these were all transcribed and later analysed, the recommendations were sort of popping up as the conversations were going through. So a first important one, which of course essentially is the subject of the report and very much the subject of today's event, that actually carrying on with the day-to-day, doing your in-business activities, it might be a really good idea to focus on building leadership capability at the same time. Now, I think we're seeing far more of that on-the-job training, learning from a very systematic approach to learning from experience. And of course, that contrasts quite a lot with old models of leadership development, where people tended to be sent away to get developed on courses and then brought back. And what this recommendation is saying, why don't we actually think about leadership capability, developing it when people are doing the jobs that we've asked them to do or the jobs that they're in role for? Again, going back to that idea of needing people from outside the sector, how about looking at what's going on in organisations in different sectors? Now, this is so linked with innovation, because an innovation in one sector might really just be copying to a large extent what somebody is doing in another sector, but you don't know about that, and that unless you build bridges, unless you find out, unless you join those networks that I was talking about. Because what you, of course, you don't want to be doing is reinventing the wheel, thinking you've done something absolutely marvelous, and then later find out actually it would have been a lot quicker if you'd done some investigation and found out that not only are people doing it, but you could learn from that and adapt it and make it even better in your own context. This one is so interesting for us at the Institute of Leadership and Management, and I'll tell you why in a couple of minutes. This idea that actually we really need to get what leadership is, and that it's a bit more than vision, this great idea for what the future is, this resilience that keeps coming back. We keep being told we need to be resilient. And I think one of the challenges that I certainly would have about resilience is, well, isn't that then saying if you're not succeeding, if you're not adapting to all the changes that go on around you, you're just not resilient enough? So if you buck up, you get a bit more resilient, then you'll be able to cope with whatever's thrown at you. And of course, that is not fair. And it's an organisation, if that was the sort of dominant discourse, is not taking their responsibility to help people be resilient, to ensure that the changes are manageable, that people are given the skills, information to cope with them. And again, this idea of leaders being great communicators, of course, that is important, because communication is really essentially, through conversation, how we get things done. But at the Institute of Leadership and Management, we've been talking about leadership being so much more than a sort of collection of personality traits like decisiveness and courage and the other things that we hear, and a vision, and ability then to communicate that vision. And for a long time, I think people thought, well, that was leadership. But what the housing leaders were telling us, do you know what? There's an awful lot more to leadership than that. Yes, of course, the character of the leader is important. Of course, the leader needs to have a vision, some idea of what they'd like the future to be like, to be able to communicate that so people can join in, amend, adapt, change it, and work together towards it. But leadership also involves so many more things. What about achievement? delivering results, actually doing what you're supposed to be doing, rather than just talking about what we're going to do next or what the future might hold. It's that day in, day out management of performance. And of course, part of that, really important, is owning the results of your leadership, taking responsibility for mistakes that you might make, as well as, of course, the successes that you have. In some research done quite a few years ago, CEOs of failing organizations were actually asked to explain the failure. And when those same CEOs were revisited sometime later, the CEOs that had taken responsibility for the failure and seen that their role in it, whether they missed something, they didn't do something correctly, were so much more likely to be successful at their next venture. The CEOs that blamed the failure on all manner of external events were much more likely to fail again. And that's what ownership is. It's recognizing your role in events, what you can do, and of course, what you can't do. And finally, we think collaboration, absolutely an essential leadership capability. And this is far more than just, I say just teamwork, as though teamwork's not difficult enough. It's more than teamwork. It's being able to work across teams, across departments, across organizations, to be able to access and flourish in those networks that I was talking about, to join a project team, to be able to add value, be able to work with others and then to leave it, and everyone speak well of you. Those are collaboration capabilities. And all of these 5 dimensions of leadership are things that we think are really important. And you can see from this that we're not obsessing about what's leadership and what's management, firstly because definitions of what those are change over time. Often we're doing both at the same time, or we're in one mode more than another. And also, people don't really have the opportunity to think whether, shall I be a managerial about this or shall I try and lead? They're just coping to the context in which their problems, their leadership is taking place. So leadership is huge. And I suppose you've all noticed as well, even in the past 5 years, for example, how much trendier leadership has become. And it's like management is the poor relation. But they're both really important. And so often definitions are blurred. So that's what we think about leadership, and that's really so well reflected in the focus groups, how much there is to it, but of course how much you can learn. These are not things that you're just born with. This is study, this is knowledge, this is finding out, and this is hopefully what the partnership between our institute and your institute, the Institute of Housing, will mean, that we're developing capability in leadership while we are also leading in the sector. Talent pipelines. Well, how could we not have talent if we didn't have a pipeline or some way of developing it? And that notion of succession planning, only last week there was a big report, an interview with somebody who was saying, look, if we're very short-termist about laying off young people at the moment as a response to COVID, to contraction in our businesses, we're really going to be in a mess in a few years' time. And so here the recommendation again came from for the people in the groups. Let's have a talent pipeline. Very important to identify future leaders, of course, to give them those development opportunities. But let's remember the entire demographic of the existing workforce. Let's not just look to try and replicate the sorts of teams we've got at the moment, because our workforces are much more diverse than that. And of course, that's one of the reasons that we've got Cole here today talking to us about diversity and inclusion. So how do we develop future leaders? How do we ensure that perhaps people working from outside actually joining from other sectors, get to know industry, or people perhaps joining at senior levels? And there was such a concentration and recognition of the importance of understanding the front line. And while this might be a particular issue in housing as something that's considered to be absolutely imperative, I think anybody who works in any sector, that experience, that customer interface of speaking to customers, knowing what their wants and their aspirations are, what their expectations are of the organization, is just brilliant experience for anybody. So the final recommendation was really again a recognition, perhaps we do need those people from outside, but we have to be systematic and deliberate about how we develop them, and they need to be supported in gaining that specialist industry knowledge. So they have to understand about housing, but of course that's as true for people, new entrants joining, who have got to learn. You've got to learn about how to lead in an organization, as well as to know what it is the organization's doing. So if you go back to our representation of leadership, there is so much one can learn, not only about how you do it, but also about what you're doing. And it's doing both of those things at the same time that seem to be a very, very strong finding from this report. So I've gone through that not too quickly, I hope. I hope it's been interesting. And as I say, you know, the report, obviously the longer version of the report is available for somebody who'd like to read it. And anybody who'd like to get in touch with me to comment on it, or, you know, add to it, give us feedback. We always love to hear from people, especially obviously when we've done some research in a particular sector, which is a real privilege for us. And I don't know if anybody's here today that actually contributed to those focus groups, but we couldn't have done it without them. It was very generous of them to give their time and all their energy and enthusiasm for what obviously is a sector overflowing with talent. It's just a question of harnessing it.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. We've got a few questions. We've probably got time to cover one question now. The other questions won't be lost. We'll either pick them up later in the Q&A, or perhaps, Kate, you can pick them up kind of offline, or perhaps afterwards in the networking session. But and this is a question that's close to my heart, actually. How diverse were the participants that took part in the research?
That is a question I cannot make up an answer to. Because I don't have the demographic details with me today. I could certainly find out. My first response to that would be, it will not be as diverse as it could have been, because actually it was senior leaders, and a recognition was that the senior leaders at the moment in the sector are not diverse enough.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, and something that essentially is what we're trying to discuss today, isn't it? How do we get that diversity at a leadership level? There's some other questions about specific examples from out of sector, and also about how we develop those in sector. I'm going to, just for the purposes of time, because I know people tend to be quite back to back with meetings and they like to have a break, move on to our next speaker, but we can pick this up potentially later in the Q&A. And I just want to thank you for your brilliant presentation. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you for letting me.
So we're now going to, I'm now going to hand over to Alysha Burrell of Homes England and CIH Futures. She's very passionate about helping the next generation of leaders reach their full potential. CIH Futures is a brilliant arm of the CIH, and is really the voice of young people. And Kate alluded in her presentation to this point around social heart versus commercial skills. You know, I don't think that the social value question is there at all amongst young people. If anything, I think we've lost it along the way in terms of our sector. But where we are lacking is enabling those individuals to kind of move on and get the skills that they need to be the leaders that we need in our organisations. Alysha's going to talk about her career journey in the housing sector. What she sees as the challenges are and the barriers for securing a leadership role. So it possibly speaks to your question, Tosheen, about how we develop leaders in the sector, and also what CIH Futures are doing to provide leadership opportunities for young people. So I'll bring Alysha to the stage now and give her a chance to talk to everybody.
Thanks for that introduction, Ellie. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to talk on behalf of CIH Futures. So as Ellie mentioned, my name's Alysha Burrell. I work for Homes England and I'm on the board of CRH Futures, which for me is amazing because making housing a career of choice and really attracting more young people into the housing sector is something that I'm really passionate about. What I'm going to do is just start off by talking about my career journey to date, and specifically the leadership opportunities that I've benefited from in my career. And then I'm going to link my career journey with what I see that the future challenges are for the sector. But I'm going to base this on my perspective as a young person. And then, yeah, I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit about what CRH Futures are doing to provide leadership opportunities for young people in the sector. So to start off with, when I was at school, I thought that I wanted to work in the financial sector. So I tried to do a number of unpaid placements at financial companies, such as accountancy firms. And after college, I went on to do my economics degree at the University of Northampton. And this was just after the financial crisis and the recession, and young people were being called the lost generation, because unemployment was an all-time high, and young people being hit the worst. And at that time, I was determined that me and my cohort would not be included in that label of that lost generation, and that we'd all be able to get jobs after graduating. So I decided to set up a economic society with the aim to develop students' employability skills, and invited speakers in from across the civil service and the financial sector, and organised trips to various places and just ran general sessions on leadership and communication skills for students. I'm going to relate this to one of the challenges that I see for the housing sector, which is the fact that at this current time, young people are in a similar position in terms of job losses, but also that the challenge of attracting young people like myself who are studying a non-housing related qualification, who aren't thinking about working in the housing sector, but who have a passion to help others, who may have, innovative and creative ideas and are able to run with it to make a difference. Where if they were in the housing sector could bring, fresh ideas and new perspectives. And I think that the future challenge isn't just being able to attract young people who have innovative ideas, but for those who are already in the sector, being able to create a culture and environment in the organisation where people can thrive and feel comfortable to share their ideas and lead on them, which may, improve productivity of the housing association or wherever they work. So going back to my career, because I was doing a economics degree, I thought that I either, wanted to become an economist or work in the financial sector. So I did a number of internships for financial companies to see if that is what I wanted to do. I did 2 of them. The last one that I did was during my second year at university at the Bank of New York Mellon. It was great. I enjoyed it. I developed, contacts. I enjoyed the city life, working in London for the summer, because I'm from Nottingham. The internships that I did taught me an important lesson, which was that I actually didn't want to work in the financial sector, because even though, I enjoyed what I did, it wasn't meaningful enough for me, and I'd always wanted to do something with more of a social purpose, and so that's the second challenge that I'm going to talk about for the housing sector, which is the challenge of attracting young people who don't know what the housing sector does, but they want to work in a sector that has a strong social purpose. So now Simon Sinek's famous TED talk about how great leaders inspires action calls on business leaders to start with why. And he explains that most organizations can explain what they do. Some organizations can explain how they do what they do, but very few organizations can explain why they do what they do. And I think this is very important for the housing sector to be able to relay why it does what it does, why do housing associations exist. And this is really important to be able to attract people in particular, the young people, the new generation, the millennial generation, you know, the Gen Z generation, who don't just want to know what does housing involve, but why should I work in the sector? Why is it going to benefit me? And so I think that the challenge is just being clear about what the social purpose and mission is of the sector. So, you know, Ellie and Kate have mentioned, we know that there is a skills gap. And if the sector, wants to increase the number of people in the sector, and particularly young people, then it should really be going into, academic institutions and schools and colleges to talk to young people about what the sector has to offer. Now, there was some research that was done a couple of years ago, and it showed that only 10% of young people would actually consider a career in the sector, despite doing subjects such as STEM, which would qualify them to work in the sector. And I think, this is largely due to the negative perception that the industry has, that it's all manual work, that it's, unexciting and male dominated. And there's also some other research that shows that by the time a student gets to university, they've already decided what career, they want to pursue, and the type of companies that they want to work for, like myself, who thought I wanted to work in finance, which is why I think that talking to young people from an early age is so important to improve their long-term engagement with the sector. And if you look at the companies that do attract top young talent, if you look at the companies that most graduates want to work for, they're the financial companies, they're the technology companies, even the law firms and the healthcare companies. Why? Well, because they've developed that reputable brand amongst students. They're the sectors and the companies that people have clarity about, the career options that are available, and the career routes that they can pursue. Some are known to provide that stability, some are known to be, strong in innovation, and some are known to have that impact. And I think that if you're, a young person and, you're thinking about what sector you can work in that will provide that impact that you want to have, where you can go home at the end of the day and say, I helped somebody today, or my work made a difference today, then what better sector to work in than housing? People want to work in nursing because, they want to help people want to become lawyers because, what they want to help people or challenge the system. Young people even want to become Instagrammers and YouTubers because they want to have influence. Now, young people should really want to work in housing to have the impact and to have the influence that they want to have. But the challenge is that they don't know what the housing sector actually does or has to offer. And so I think that the leadership challenge there is transforming the image of the housing sector to attract young people and being able to better explain what the sector does and has to offer. Now, after I'd finished my second year internship at the Bank of New York Mellon, I went on a cultural study abroad trip to India for 2 weeks. And whilst I was there, I visited one of the largest slums in Asia called Dharavi, which houses over 1 million people who all live in squalid conditions, without proper access to sanitation, poor infrastructure. But it really opened up my eyes to inequality and the impact of poverty. I saw homelessness on a scale I'd never seen before. And so when I got back to England, I was more aware of homelessness around me. And when I got back to university for my final year, I did my dissertation on slums and housing and the impact that it has on a country's economic development. After I graduated, I took a year out and I went traveling across Southeast Asia and Australia, which was fantastic. And then I did my master's in development economics at University. And again, I did my dissertation about slums and housing but in Ghana, because the last place that I went was on a volunteering program to Ghana to support local people who wanted to start their own businesses and improve the economic development within a local area. After I finished my master's, I went to work for Homes England, which is where I am now, and I started on the GEM programme, which is a year-long housing development programme. And I'd say that this opportunity gave me a deeper understanding of the wider housing sector, what it's like working with tenants. It gave me a broader breadth of understanding of what the sector does. So I was on the GEM programme whilst I started working in the product development team at Homes England, which involved doing research and working with banks and other non-bank lenders to help create new financial products to get more private sector investment into the market to get more homes built. Because I was on the GEM programme, I was given a mentor. And I'd say, you know, I had quite a few development opportunities that I benefited from. And so I'd say that the third challenge for the sector is being able to develop the skills of those in the sector. So, for example, you know, writing my dissertation about slums and housing gave me the research and financial skills. And I mentioned that I'd been traveling, but I mentioned that because of the skills that I'd gained whilst traveling, such as, you know, building resilience and improving adaptability and stress management, which help you in the workplace, but those skills were gained through experience. And so I think the challenge is providing and opening up opportunities for people, as I think Kate mentioned, to gain the relevant technical, but also soft skills and breadth of understanding of what the sector does by actually learning through experience, through shadowing, or secondments. So I've briefly talked about my career journey into the sector and the future challenges of one, attracting young people like myself who are studying a non-housing related qualification, but who have transferable skills and bring new ideas to work in the sector. The second one I talked about was better explaining what the sector has to offer and transforming the image of the sector. And the third one was developing the technical and soft skills on the sector. I'm now just going to briefly touch on what I see as the barriers for those working in the sector to secure a leadership role, and in particular for those who are underrepresented. So we know that the sector doesn't just have an ageing issue, the sector has a diversity issue. There are a limited number of women in the sector, and even smaller number from an ethnic minority background. And so I see the barrier for those to secure a leadership role is that there are a lack of role models for people to look up to. There are a lack of, you know, female role models. There are a lack of BAME role models for young people to look up to and say, you know, wow, you know, look at that chief executive, because of the impact she's making, I want to work in housing. And I think that the challenge isn't just the lack of representation, but also the lack of knowledge and recognition of those who do actually work in the sector. And I think the question is maybe why don't we know about them? How do we overcome this? Well, I'd say by, you know, diversifying the sector, especially at board and senior management level, and recognition of those who are underrepresented and do have talent that is unidentified and not recognised. I'm just going to use a quick example of why, you know, this is important. So let's say a housing organisation, you know, recruited a graduate, and this graduate asked to do a walk of the office of the organisation to get a feel for the place before they accept and sign the contract. So they get taken on a floor walk, and they see that the organisation isn't very diverse, and not just diverse in terms of age. I know that's what I've mainly been talking about, but in terms of gender, socioeconomic background. Then even if they did, you know, like what the organisation stands for, then maybe, you know, they wouldn't join because they feel like they're not the right fit for the company. Or maybe, let's say, the housing organization has got it completely right and, you know, is a diverse organization and ends up attracting the right people. But let's say the organization doesn't have an embedded culture of training and development. Then, you know, you're attracting people and not retaining them. And so that's the second barrier I'm going to talk about, because retention, I think is extremely important, especially because research shows that millennials like to job hop between every 2 to 4 years. And one of the most important things to millennials is career progression. And so I think one of the ways to actually support career progression and promote inclusivity is by establishing a mentoring system, but also a reverse mentoring system where senior leaders and executives can take the role of the mentee, and more junior members of staff act as the mentor to teach what they know. This may be, you know, sharing knowledge on technology, or, you know, talking about new IT systems, or it may be based on race and ethnicity or gender. But the idea is that it offers new insights and different perspectives. So I'm starting reverse mentoring with a middle-aged white director of an organization who wants to get a fresh perspective, which hopefully will help him better understand his team and gain a new perspective about the organization. So those are two of the barriers that I'd say facing the sector: lack of role models and lack of career development opportunities. Now, in terms of what CRH Futures is doing to provide leadership opportunities for those in the sector, it's launched a strategy called Outside In, which is all about giving more opportunities to those building their careers, and how sets out a strategy about how we can be more inclusive as a board. Another thing that we did was we launched the housing competition in March, which aimed to attract more young people into the sector, and the winner of the competition gained practical work experience and was able to improve their leadership skills through the projects that they were given to complete. I'm going to leave it there, but just to conclude by saying that I think that whatever, you know, leadership strategy it is, or however the leader strategy is that the sector pursues, I really think that equality, diversity and inclusion really needs to sit at the heart of whatever leadership strategy it is that the sector pursues.
Thank you very much, Alysha. I'm conscious that we're quite tight on time, and it's a really fascinating career journey that you've had, and I'm really interested particularly in the stuff that you did abroad and what you might have brought back from there. We're not going to get time now to cover the questions, but we are going to get time in the Q&A panel later. It's really important, I think, with the video setup that we do make sure that people get proper breaks. So I think we should take a break now until 11:05, bring Cull in. I've made a note of all the questions, so nothing's going to get lost, and we'll come back and revisit those as part of the panel later. But I really appreciate your presentation today. It was really interesting. Thank you. So if people want to kind of do what they need to do, maybe go and network, get a cup of tea, we'll come back at 11:05 to hear from Dr. Varma. Thank you, everybody.